Welcome to our channel, where we share powerful, heart-touching stories that will inspire and move you. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, share, and spread the love. Today's story is one you won't want to miss. Le Beau Hotel stood tall and majestic in the heart of London, its golden facade glowing against the evening sky. Known as the crown jewel of the city, it was where the elite came to indulge in extravagance and decadence. Tonight, the ballroom of Le Beau was alive with music, laughter, and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. The night's air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the hum of whispered conversations, as London's wealthiest gathered to celebrate another evening of opulence. The ballroom was a breathtaking sight, with every corner dripping in luxury. Crystal chandeliers hung like clusters of stars, casting a soft golden glow over the room. The walls were adorned with rich tapestries and intricate gilded moldings, reflecting the grandeur of the night. Polished marble floors stretched across the ballroom, shimmering under the light and making the entire space feel like a scene from a dream. On stage, a group of dancers performed an intricate routine, their sequined costumes glittering with every move they made. They moved in perfect synchronization, their bodies weaving the story of seduction and allure. Among them was Sandra, a striking woman with fiery red hair and piercing emerald eyes. Her every movement was captivating, her dance flawless, yet behind her practiced smile was a heart weighed down with fear and sadness. Sandra had been a dancer at Le Beau Hotel for years, and her beauty and grace had always drawn the attention of everyone in the room. But tonight, that attention felt suffocating. Her dance wasn't for pleasure, and the admiration she received only deepened her sense of dread. She knew that when her performance ended, her role at Le Beau would take a much darker turn. From across the room, Chris, the hotel's manager, watched her closely. His tall frame and sharp features gave him an air of authority, and his dark eyes followed Sandra's every move with a calculating gaze. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored suit that made him stand out among the crowd. But beneath his polished exterior was a man who had become deeply entangled in the secrets that lay beneath Le Beau's glamorous surface. Chris had once been at the top of London's elite, a rising star in the world of luxury hotel management. 5 years ago, he had been the envy of everyone, managing Le Beau with precision and charm. His relationship with Amelia, the daughter of the hotel's wealthy owner, the talk of the town. Together, they were the power couple that ruled London's social scene. But that was before Amelia left him, choosing the financial security of a billionaire crypto mogul over Chris. The betrayal had left Chris bitter and hardened. Now, he ran Le Beau with an iron fist, but his position was tainted by the dark dealings that happened behind the hotel's gilded walls. The once glorious vision of his life had soured, leaving him a man consumed by ambition and control. Amelia was at the party tonight, seated elegantly at a table not far from the stage. She was still as beautiful as ever, her golden hair cascading in soft waves, her designer gown fitting her perfectly. Her fiancé, the billionaire mogul, sat by her side, his arm draped possessively over her shoulder. Amelia's smile was flawless, but her eyes were cold, distant. She watched the room with the same calculating gaze as Chris, though now it was from a distance, as if she were above it all. As the night wore on, the party grew more indulgent. The guests, fueled by champagne and the seductive atmosphere, began to let go of their inhibitions. Laughter echoed through the room, the conversations became louder, and the boundary between elegance and excess began to blur. Scandalous behavior started to surface, hidden in the shadows of the ballroom. Sandra, still dancing on stage, could feel the weight of the eyes on her. She danced with a practiced smile, but inside, her heart was pounding. The ballroom, with all its beauty and grandeur, felt like a cage. Every step, every twirl reminded her of the life she had been forced into, a life far removed from the dreams she once had. After her performance ended, Sandra slipped off the stage and made her way to a quiet corner of the ballroom, seeking a moment to collect herself. She needed a breath of air, away from the eyes that watched her too closely, from the reality that loomed just beyond the sparkling chandeliers. But even in the quiet, there was no real escape. The darkness of her situation was ever present, a shadow that followed her wherever she went. Le Beau Hotel was not just a place of luxury. It was a fortress of secrets. Behind its glamorous facade, a dark world thrived, one that few knew about, and even fewer dared to question. Amelia's father, the hotel's owner, ran an illegal drug operation from the very rooms where London's elites celebrated their wealth and power. And Sandra, like many of the other dancers, had been used as an unwitting pawn in his dangerous game. The dancers at Le Beau weren't just performers. They were couriers, forced to transport drugs hidden in their costumes, their every move monitored by men like Chris, who ensured that the operation ran smoothly. Sandra had tried to escape this life before, but every attempt was met with threats and violence. Her dreams of freedom were crushed by the weight of the power that controlled her. As Sandra leaned against the wall, lost in her thoughts, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see a security guard standing in front of her, his face expressionless. Without a word, he handed her a small piece of paper. Sandra's heart sank as she unfolded it. The note was simple, but its meaning was all too familiar. Room 502. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew what was expected of her next. The note wasn't an invitation, it was a command. The dread settled deep in her chest as she slipped the paper into her dress and made her way toward the elevators. There was no escaping it. As she stepped into the elevator, the golden doors closed with a soft click, sealing her fate. Le Beau Hotel, with all its beauty and grandeur, was no longer a place of hope and dreams. For Sandra, it had become a prison, and tonight, like so many nights before, she would pay the price for a life she had never chosen. But even as the elevator climbed higher, taking her closer to room 502, there was a flicker of something inside her, a small spark of resolve. Sandra knew she couldn't endure this forever. Something had to change, and though she didn't know when or how, she vowed that one day she would find a way to escape the gilded cage of Le Beau Hotel. And when she did, she would make sure those who had trapped her would pay. For now, she had to survive the night. The elegant doors of the elevator slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the long, dimly lit hallway that led to room 502. Sandra stepped out, her heart heavy with dread as her heels clicked softly against the polished marble floor. The luxury of Le Beau Hotel's corridors, adorned with golden accents and intricate patterns, felt like a twisted mockery of her own life. She had spent years trapped within these opulent walls, but none of the wealth or glamour ever reached her. It was all just a mask, beautiful on the outside, rotten underneath. As she walked toward room 502, her hands trembled slightly. She had received this note too many times before. Every time, it carried the same weight, the same unspoken demand. The dancers of Le Beau, glamorous as they appeared on stage, were trapped in a much darker world, a world controlled by Amelia's father, the owner of the hotel and the mastermind behind an illegal drug operation. For years, he had used the dancers as couriers, hiding drugs in their costumes and forcing them to transport them to wealthy clients. Sandra had once been naive enough to believe that the world of Le Beau was glamorous. She had thought her dancing career would bring her success, freedom, and perhaps even happiness. But it wasn't long before she realized that beneath the sparkling chandeliers and golden tapestries lay a network of corruption that she couldn't escape. Every attempt she made to leave was met with threats, and sometimes worse, brutal violence that left her bruised and broken, both physically and emotionally. She reached room 502, her fingers trembling as she turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was lavish, like everything at Le Beau: plush carpets, velvet drapes, and a chandelier that sparkled like diamonds. But to Sandra, it was a prison. Her stomach churned as she saw the man waiting for her. He was a wealthy client of the hotel, one she had seen before, his face lustrous, and his grin unsettling. He had the air of someone who believed he could buy anything, including her. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice slick and filled with entitlement. "I've been waiting." Sandra forced the smile, though her insides twisted with disgust. She had no choice but to comply. Her body was no longer her own. It hadn't been for a long time. Every night like this stripped away another piece of her soul, leaving her feeling emptier and more broken. The encounter that followed was brutal, as they always were. The man, having had too much to drink, grew rougher as the night wore on. Sandra did what she had learned to do. She detached herself, letting her mind drift far away from her body. It was the only way to survive the horror of it, the only way to keep from breaking completely. When it was over, she lay there in the dim light of the room, her body aching and her spirit fractured, staring at the chandelier overhead. The grandeur of the room was a cruel contrast to the violence she had just endured. As dawn broke, Sandra managed to pull herself together. She stumbled out of the room, her legs shaky, and made her way down the hallway, barely able to hold herself upright. The hotel was quiet at this hour, the party from the night before long over, and the guests now asleep in their luxury suites. But even in the stillness, the weight of LeBeau's secrets hung heavy in the air. Sandra felt it pressing down on her with every step. She reached the lobby, her mind a blur of pain and exhaustion. Just as she was about to slip out unnoticed, she heard voices, familiar voices, coming from the hotel office down the hall. She paused, her instincts urging her to leave, but curiosity held her in place. The voices belonged to Chris and Amelia's father. Sandra crept closer, pressing herself against the wall outside the office door. The conversation was hushed but urgent. "I'm telling you, things are getting riskier," Chris was saying, his voice tense. "The authorities are starting to ask questions." Amelia's father let out a dismissive chuckle. "Let them ask questions. They won't find anything. We've been doing this for years, and no one's ever gotten close." "But the dancers, some of them are getting restless," Chris argued. "If one of them talks." "They won't talk," Amelia's father interrupted coldly. "We make sure of that. They know the consequences." Sandra's heart pounded in her chest as she listened. Her mind raced, piecing together what she had suspected for years, but had never heard confirmed out loud. Chris wasn't just complicit in what was happening at LeBeau. He was fully involved, managing the operations, helping Amelia's father keep the dancers under control. Tears stung Sandra's eyes as the reality of it hit her. She had once trusted Chris. Years ago, when she first started at LeBeau, she had seen him as someone who might protect her, someone who could help her navigate the cutthroat world of high society. But he was just as rotten as the rest of them. He had watched her suffer, knowing full well what was happening, and he had done nothing to stop it. The conversation in the office continued, but Sandra couldn't listen anymore. She turned and hurried away, her mind spinning. She needed to get out of LeBeau. She needed to find a way to escape this nightmare for good. But where could she go? The world outside the hotel had been cut off from her for so long that it seemed almost impossible to imagine life beyond these walls. Back in the ballroom, the guests were beginning to stir, the faint sounds of life returning to the hotel as the day broke. But for Sandra, the ballroom was no longer a place of music and laughter. It was a battlefield, a place where her soul had been torn apart piece by piece. And now, after hearing Chris's betrayal firsthand, she knew that the battle was far from over. She couldn't leave yet, not without a plan. She had to be smart, had to gather information. And most importantly, she had to find a way to bring them all down. Chris, Amelia's father, and every other monster who used LeBeau's walls to hide their crimes. With a heavy heart and her body aching from the night's horrors, Sandra made her way back to her small, cramped room in the hotel's servant quarters. She sank onto the bed, tears slipping down her face as she stared at the ceiling. But even through her tears, there was a flicker of determination. Sandra knew that if she didn't act, she would be trapped in this nightmare forever. The time had come to stop running, to stop hiding. She had been a pawn in their game for too long, but now she was ready to fight back. And when she did, they would all regret ever underestimating her. It had been 5 long years since Sandra had last danced under the gleaming chandeliers of Le Beau Hotel. 5 years since she had been forced into that dark, corrupt world, used as a pawn, discarded like an object. The memories of those nights had never left her. She carried the scars with her, both visible and invisible, her soul weighed down by the trauma of her past. Her life had taken a steep descent after that fateful night in room 502. No matter how much she wanted to forget, the darkness of Le Beau lingered in her mind. Now, 5 years later, Sandra found herself in a different place. She had drifted through the streets, homeless, surviving on whatever scraps of kindness she could find. Her mind, once sharp and filled with dreams, was now a fog of trauma and pain. She had lost everything, her dignity, her hopes, her sense of self. But despite it all, deep inside, there still burned a flicker of anger, a desire for revenge against those who had ruined her life. Sandra was sitting on a cold bench in a desolate park when she saw a familiar figure approaching. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized him. Chris, the man who had once been her manager at Le Beau, the man who had watched her suffer, the man she had once believed might help her, but who had instead been complicit in her exploitation. Sandra's body tensed. She hadn't seen him in years, but the sight of his face brought a rush of memories flooding back. Memories she had tried so hard to bury. He was still the same, tall, well-dressed, his sharp features betraying little emotion. As he neared, his gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment they simply stared at each other in silence. "Sandra," he said quietly, his voice carrying the hint of regret. "It's been a long time." She didn't respond, her eyes narrowing as she watched him carefully. She couldn't trust him. Not after everything that had happened. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," Chris continued, his tone softer than she remembered. "But I've been looking for you." "Why?" Sandra's voice was cold, her defenses up. "What do you want?" Chris sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if the weight of his words were too much to bear. "Things have changed since you left," he said. "Amelia's father, he's not in control anymore. The operation, it's falling apart." Sandra's heart raced. Could it be true? Was the man who had orchestrated her suffering finally losing his grip on the empire he had built? The thought stirred something inside her, a spark of hope, perhaps, or maybe it was just the desire to see them all pay for what they had done. "And why does that matter to me?" Sandra asked, her voice filled with bitterness. "What do you want, Chris?" Chris shifted, as if he was uncomfortable with the conversation. He hesitated before speaking again. "I want to make things right," he said quietly. "I know I was part of the problem. I didn't help you when I should have. But I want to help now." Sandra scoffed, crossing her arms. "Help? After all this time? Why should I believe anything you say?" Chris looked down at the ground, his face clouded with guilt. "I don't expect you to believe me," he said softly. "But there's an opportunity for you to face them. Amelia is getting married, and the wedding is happening at Le Beau." Sandra's breath caught in her throat. Amelia. The name brought back flashes of her former life, the woman who had once been at the center of it all, the woman who had played her part in destroying Sandra's life. And now she was getting married, celebrating in the very place where so many lives had been broken. "Why would I want to go back there?" Sandra asked, though her mind was already racing. "Because," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you'll have the chance to confront them. All of them. Amelia, her father, everyone who's wronged you. They'll all be there." For a moment, Sandra was silent, her heart pounding in her chest. It was tempting, too tempting. The thought of seeing those who had hurt her, of finally having the chance to expose them for the monsters they were, made her pulse quicken. But at the same time, the idea of going back to Le Beau filled her with dread. Could she really return to that place? Could she face the demons of her past? "I don't know," she murmured, more to herself than to Chris. Chris took a step closer, his voice soft but urgent. "Sandra, I know you're scared, but this could be your chance to finally get some closure, to make them pay. You deserve that." Sandra looked up at him, her emotions a whirlwind inside her. Part of her wanted to run, to hide from the memories and the pain. But another part of her, one that had been dormant for so long, wanted revenge. She wanted justice for everything she had endured. "What's in it for you?" she asked, her eyes narrowing again. "Why are you doing this?" Chris hesitated before answering. "I don't expect you to believe this, but I've changed. After you left, things got worse. I saw what they were doing to the others, and I couldn't keep being a part of it. I left, but I've been carrying the guilt ever since. This is my way of trying to make things right." Sandra didn't know if she could believe him, but the idea of finally confronting Amelia, her father, and all the others who had ruined her life was too powerful to ignore. "When is it?" she asked, her voice steady now. "The wedding is in a week," Chris said. "At Le Beau. You'll be my guest." Sandra nodded slowly, her mind already working out a plan. This was it. This was her chance. A week to prepare herself, a week to gather her strength, a week to decide how she would face the people who had destroyed her. "Fine," she said, standing up from the bench. "I'll go." Chris nodded, relief washing over his face. "Thank you, Sandra. I promise I won't let you down." Sandra didn't respond. She turned and walked away, her mind buzzing with thoughts of what was to come. She knew that going back to Le Beau would be dangerous, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of purpose. She wasn't going back as a victim. This time, she would be in control. And when the time was right, she would make sure that Amelia, her father, and Chris got exactly what they deserved. As she walked through the city streets, the sun setting behind her, Sandra felt a shift inside. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else. Determination. She had been beaten down, broken, and discarded, but she had survived. Now it was time to take back her life. The gates of Le Beau Hotel opened slowly, revealing the sprawling estate where Amelia's grand wedding was set to take place. It was a week after Chris had found Sandra on that park bench, and now she stood before the place that haunted her dreams, dressed in a beautiful gown that made her look like someone from another life. Her heart raced as she looked at the opulence that surrounded her. The perfectly manicured gardens, the marble fountains sparkling in the sunlight, the luxurious decorations that made the hotel seem like a fairy tale brought to life. But for Sandra, Le Beau was no fairy tale. It was a gilded cage filled with darkness. Standing here, she felt as if the walls were closing in on her, the memories pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. Yet, this time was different. She wasn't here as a dancer, forced into a life of exploitation. This time, she was here for a purpose, a plan forming in her mind. She was no longer the victim. She was here to face the demons that had torn her life apart, and she wasn't going to back down. Chris had arranged everything, making sure she looked like an invited guest. The gown she wore was expensive, its soft fabric flowing elegantly as she walked, her hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. To anyone looking at her, she appeared every bit the part of a high society guest, blending in seamlessly with the other glamorous attendees. But under the surface, Sandra's emotions churned like a storm. Her hands trembled as she walked through the grand entrance of the ballroom, the very room where 5 years earlier her life had fallen apart. The sparkling chandeliers, the polished marble floors, the soft hum of laughter and conversation. It was all the same. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The people who had once been her audience were now strangers, unaware of the battle raging inside her. As she entered the ballroom, her eyes quickly found Amelia. There she was, the woman at the center of it all, looking every bit the radiant bride in a designer wedding gown that glittered under the lights. Her golden hair was styled to perfection, her smile bright and flawless. Amelia looked happy, as if she had no idea of the pain she had caused others, including Sandra. By her side was her fiancé, a billionaire crypto mogul, tall and imposing. His presence exuded wealth and power, and the guests surrounding him hung on his every word. Amelia had certainly traded up when she had left Chris for this man. Together, they looked like the perfect couple, the embodiment of success and luxury. Sandra's stomach twisted as she watched them, 1,000 emotions swirling inside her. She remembered the nights she had spent suffering, while people like Amelia celebrated their privilege. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on her, but she forced herself to stay calm. There was a plan, and she needed to stay focused. She walked further into the ballroom, keeping to the edges of the crowd. She recognized some of the faces from years ago, the same guests who had turned a blind eye to what was really happening behind the scenes at Le Beau. They laughed and danced, blissfully unaware of the horrors that had played out in the rooms upstairs. But not everyone was unaware. Chris stood near the bar, his gaze scanning the room. He had a stiff, uneasy expression, and Sandra could tell that he was nervous. He had brought her here, but even now, he seemed unsure of what would unfold. Their shared history weighed on both of them, but for Chris, the stakes were even higher. He had been complicit in everything that had happened to her. And while he claimed he wanted to make things right, Sandra wasn't sure if she could fully trust him. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and Chris gave her a small nod, as if to remind her that he was there if she needed him. But Sandra wasn't relying on him. She couldn't afford to. This was her fight. As the evening progressed, the ballroom filled with more guests, and the celebration grew livelier. The orchestra played a soft melody, and waiters circulated with trays of champagne. To anyone watching, it was a perfect night. But for Sandra, it was all a facade, a beautiful lie meant to cover up the darkness underneath. After some time, Chris approached her, his expression tight. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, his voice low so that no one could overhear. Sandra gave him a quick nod, not trusting herself to speak. She didn't want to reveal how close she was to losing control of her emotions. "You don't have to do this," Chris said, his gaze searching her face for any sign of hesitation. "If you want to leave, we can go." Sandra shook her head firmly. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "I'm not leaving until I confront her." Chris sighed, clearly torn. He had brought her here, knowing what it meant for her to return to Le Beau, but now that they were in the middle of it, he seemed unsure of whether it was the right decision. Still, Sandra wasn't backing down. This was her moment. As the evening wore on, Sandra finally saw her chance. Amelia had stepped away from her guests and was standing alone near the edge of the ballroom, looking out over the gardens beyond the large glass doors. Her back was to the room, her perfect smile now gone as she stood in quiet contemplation. Sandra's heart pounded as she made her way toward her. Each step felt heavy, like the weight of the past 5 years was pressing down on her, but she kept moving forward, her determination stronger than her fear. When she reached Amelia, she stopped just behind her, taking a deep breath before speaking. Amelia. The name left Sandra's lips like a dagger, sharp and cold. Amelia turned slowly, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion, as she took in Sandra's appearance. "Sandra." Amelia's voice was uncertain. "Is that really you?" Sandra nodded, her jaw clenched tight. "It's me." Amelia blinked, as if trying to piece together how Sandra could possibly be standing here. At her wedding, after all these years. "What are you doing here?" Sandra stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Amelia's. "I came here to confront you," she said, her voice low but firm. "For what you did to me." A flicker of something crossed Amelia's face. Guilt, maybe, or perhaps fear. But she quickly masked it, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you're talking about," Amelia said, her voice cool. "Whatever happened to you, it wasn't my fault." Sandra's heart pounded in her chest as anger surged through her. "You knew," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. You knew what your father was doing. You let it happen. You were a part of it. Amelia's eyes darted around the room, checking to see if anyone was watching. She took a step back, her voice dropping to a whisper. You have no proof of anything. Sandra's hands trembled, her rage barely contained. She wanted to scream, to make everyone in that ballroom hear the truth, but she knew she had to be careful. She couldn't blow this moment. I don't need proof, Sandra said, her voice steely. I know what you did, and now so do you. Amelia glared at her, her perfect composure slipping just slightly. You need to leave now. But Sandra didn't move. She stood tall, her eyes blazing with the fire of everything she had endured. She wasn't leaving. Not until she had her revenge. Sandra stood rooted to the spot as Amelia turned her back and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of laughing and oblivious guests. Her heart pounded in her chest, anger and frustration swirling inside her like a storm. Amelia's cold dismissal, her refusal to even acknowledge her part in the horrors Sandra had endured, had left Sandra feeling as though she'd been slapped in the face. For a moment, she considered walking out of Le Beau Hotel and never returning. Part of her wanted to leave this place, to flee from the memories that haunted her, but she knew that if she walked away now, Amelia would continue her life as if nothing had happened. The truth would remain buried, and Sandra would be left with the same scars and the same unspoken pain. No, she couldn't leave. Not yet. She needed more than a confrontation. She needed proof. Something concrete that would expose Amelia and her father for what they were. Something that would bring their empire crumbling down. As Sandra moved through the ballroom, her mind raced with ideas. She needed to find out what was really going on at Le Beau, to dig deeper than the surface-level wealth and glamour that masked the dark underworld of drugs and exploitation. And if anyone had the answers, it was Chris. He had been involved in it all from the beginning, and despite his claims of wanting to make things right, Sandra knew he was still hiding something. She spotted him near the bar, his posture stiff as he spoke to one of the hotel's staff. Chris glanced over at her, his eyes filled with apprehension. He knew something was brewing inside her. Taking a deep breath, Sandra walked over to him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Chris, she said, her voice low but firm. I need to talk to you. Now. Chris looked nervous, but he nodded, excusing himself from the staff member he had been speaking to. Let's go somewhere private, he murmured, guiding her toward a quiet hallway just outside the ballroom. The further they moved from the laughter and music, the quieter the air became. It was almost unsettling, the way the sound of celebration vanished as they walked down the corridor, leaving only the echo of their footsteps behind. When they were alone, Sandra turned to Chris, her arms crossed and her expression hard. I want the truth, she demanded. No more excuses, no more pretending. I want to know everything you've done, and everything they've done. Chris exhaled deeply, rubbing the back of his neck as he leaned against the wall. Sandra, I told you before, I was just following orders. Amelia's father, he controlled everything. I didn't have a choice. Sandra shook her head, her eyes flashing with anger. That's not good enough, Chris. I know there's more. I overheard you and her father talking that night. About the dancers, about the drugs. You were part of it, and I want to know exactly what your role was. Chris hesitated, guilt written all over his face. For a long moment, he remained silent, as if debating whether or not to finally tell her the truth. Then, slowly, he nodded. All right, he said, his voice heavy with resignation. You deserve to know, but you're not going to like what you hear. Sandra's heart tightened in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had already endured the worst. There was nothing Chris could say that would surprise her anymore. It started before you even came to Le Beau, Chris began. Amelia's father was running the drug operation for years, using the hotel as a front. The guests, the parties, they were all cover for the deals he was making with some of the wealthiest men in the city. He used the dancers as couriers because they were the least likely to be suspected. Beautiful women, performing for the elite. No one questioned them. No one ever thought they might be carrying drugs. Sandra listened in silence, her mind racing as she pieced together the puzzle that had haunted her for so long. My job, Chris continued, was to manage the logistics. I kept the dancers in line, made sure they didn't ask too many questions. And if they did, well, we made sure they stayed quiet. Sandra's stomach turned, a wave of nausea sweeping over her. So you were the one who made sure I couldn't leave, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. You were the one who kept me trapped. Chris nodded, his expression pained. I didn't want to, Sandra. I swear, I didn't. But I was in too deep. By the time I realized how bad things had gotten, it was too late for me to back out. Sandra clenched her fists, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. She had suspected all along that Chris was more involved than he had let on, but hearing it from him now, hearing him admit that he had been the one to keep her in that nightmare, felt like a fresh betrayal. And what about Amelia? Sandra asked, her voice cold. Did she know everything? Did she help her father? Chris hesitated again, and Sandra could see the conflict in his eyes. Amelia knew, he admitted. She wasn't as involved as her father, but she knew what was happening. She turned a blind eye to it because she wanted to protect her family's reputation. To her, the dancers were just part of the hotel's image. Disposable. Sandra's breath hitched, the rage inside her burning brighter. Amelia had known. She had always known, and she had chosen to look the other way, to let it happen so she could live her perfect, glamorous life. Chris shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling with his own guilt. Sandra, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I am. I wish I could go back and undo everything, but I can't. Sandra stared at him, her heart a tangled mess of emotions. She had spent years hating Chris, despising him for his role in her suffering. And now, standing here, hearing his apology, she wasn't sure what to feel. Could she forgive him? Could she trust him, even now? But forgiveness wasn't her priority. She wasn't here for apologies. She was here for justice. I don't need your apology, she said, her voice steady. What I need is proof. I'm going to expose everything. All of it. Amelia, her father, the drugs. I'm going to make sure the world knows what they did. Chris's eyes widened in surprise. Sandra, if you do that. I know the risks, she interrupted, but I'm not afraid anymore. They need to pay for what they've done, and I'm going to make sure they do. Chris stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. After a moment, he nodded. All right, he said softly. If that's what you want, I'll help you. I have access to the hotel's records, the financials, everything. I'll get you the proof you need. Sandra nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. This was it, the beginning of the end. She was finally going to expose the truth, and when she did, LeBeau would fall. The once opulent surroundings that had terrified her now seemed less imposing, less powerful. She was no longer a frightened girl trapped in a nightmare. She was a woman on a mission, determined to bring down the very people who had tried to destroy her. Chris had stayed true to his word. He handed her access to the hotel's most sensitive files, its deepest secrets hidden behind layers of security. Together, they spent hours digging through documents, emails, and financial records, uncovering the rotten core that lay beneath LeBeau's glittering surface. It was worse than Sandra had imagined. The hotel's drug operation was vast, its reach extending far beyond what she had known as a dancer. Wealthy clients, some of the most powerful men in the city, had been using LeBeau as a hub for illegal activities for years. The ballroom and suites that were the epitome of luxury by day transformed into centers of crime by night. The dancers, Sandra and the others, had been nothing more than pawns, used to transport drugs and keep the operation running smoothly. But what struck Sandra the most was how deeply entrenched Amelia's father had been in all of it. He wasn't just running a side hustle. He was the kingpin, the one who controlled everything from the shadows. And Amelia. While Chris had claimed she wasn't as involved, Sandra now saw the truth. Amelia had known everything. She had stood by, watching, allowing the exploitation and suffering to continue, all for the sake of maintaining her family's wealth and power. Sandra's rage deepened with every file she opened, every incriminating piece of evidence she found. The betrayal cut deep, but it also fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing a web of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. One evening, as Sandra and Chris sat in a small office deep in the hotel's lower levels, surrounded by piles of documents, Chris broke the silence. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "Once we expose them, there's no going back." But what would come next? Do you think Sandra is doing the right thing, karma or justice? Interested in watching the second part? Hit the subscribe button. Relax as it continues in the next tale. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video. Bye for now.